We'll finish off our discussion of non-chord tones for now by discussing oblique non-chord tones. The following non-chord tones move by step while another voice remains on the same pitch. This includes suspensions, retardations, anticipations, and pedal points. I should point out that sometimes you will have anticipations and pedal points that don't involve stepwise motion, but it is very common. When we are dealing with suspensions and retardations, almost 100% of the time, these will involve stepwise motion while another voice remains on the same pitch. Remember, that's the definition of oblique motion, having one note stay the same while another line moves on top of it. Let's talk about suspensions first, which can frequently be the most complicated of these types of non-chord tones to understand. Suspensions occur when a note from a previous chord is held over or suspended over the next chord. This creates a dissonance which then resolves down by step to form a consonance. Here's a musical example. So that B flat is the dissonant note. It is not part of that F major chord. So here you see that I've marked this P, S, and R. Now you don't always have to mark this when you're identifying non-chord tones. When you identify a suspension, you should put a circle or a parenthesis around the dissonant part and write the type of suspension above it. We'll get to how to identify that in a moment. But I do want to call attention to these moments that are marked by P, S, and R. Even though we're not writing these down, they're important to understand. The P stands for preparation. This is the pitch present in the first chord. It is preparing the suspension. The moment of suspension occurs when the chord changes and this note stays the same. So the suspension is the same pitch as the preparation, held over, and now in its new context it has become dissonant. It wants to resolve. And now we get to the resolution, which is the downward stepwise resolution. Here's the resolution. We're almost always going to be moving stepwise, and even if we're not moving stepwise, the composer is going to imply stepwise motion. So, these are the parts of the suspension: preparation, the actual suspension, and the resolution, the downward stepwise motion. Suspensions may often be embellished and can follow one another, forming suspension chains. These are really effective. Happen all over the place, especially in Baroque literature. They are just great. Now, when we do identify a suspension and talk about it being a non-chord tone and we're marking our music, we're going to identify it with two numbers. So we're going to include the dissonant or suspended interval first, and it's going to be measured against the bass. So let's go back to our preparation, suspension, and resolution. Here we have the suspended note, that B flat, and we're going to measure it above the bass. It's an octave and a fourth. And we're just going to reduce that down to 4 because life's too short. So we write that dissonant note first, and then we write the consonant note of resolution afterwards. So that's F up to A. Again, we're measuring against the bass, and that gives us a sus 4-3. The B flat is a fourth above the bass, and the note of resolution is a third above the bass, hence 4-3. So there's many suspensions that are like this. You can have 4-3 suspensions. You can have 7-6 suspensions. You can even have what's known as a consonant suspension, which is a 6-5 suspension. That's a little rare. You can also have a 2-1 suspension or a 9-8 suspension. A ninth going to an octave. Again, that's a little bit less common, but it does happen. The 4-3 and 7-6 are very common because they're quite expressive. Now, we should mention that if the suspension is in the bass voice, it is typically analyzed as a sus2-3. This is because, first of all, you can't measure the bass voice against itself. And most of the time when the bass voice is involved, it's following a specific pattern where the bass voice creates a second with another note and then resolves to a third. So usually we're just measuring against another dissonance that is against the bass. So again, that's if the bass voice has the suspended note. If it is holding over and then resolves downward, that could sound like this. Here's a third, moving to a second, and then the bass voice moves down a step, and we hear that third. Our most common suspensions are going to be those 4-3s, 7-6s, and 2-3s. Less common are the 9-8s, or if you reduce it down, it's just 2-1, and the 6-5 suspensions. But you do see those every once in a while. A retardation is similar to a suspension, except it's just the opposite. Instead of resolving downwards, it resolves upwards. Here's an example. It's not the prettiest example I've ever written, but it's something. Could go there. These don't need to be identified by interval in the manner that suspensions are analyzed. We just need to circle or put a parenthesis around where the dissonance occurs and write R or ret. Anticipations preempt the arrival of a pitch in the next chord. In other words, we sound the pitch from a future chord before the chord itself is sounded. Typically, this is approached by step and resolved by stating the same note. This very frequently occurs at cadences. And it can create some biting dissonances. But that's okay, that makes it very expressive. Again, we mostly see this at cadences, and it's being approached by step and resolved by staying on the same note. And this is known as an ant or anticipation. We're anticipating the arrival of the next note. Lastly, we'll talk about pedal points. A pedal point is a single note that is sustained, while other notes and harmonies change around it. To analyze, it is typical to simply write the chords that appear above the pedal and just ignore the inversion. Most of the time, composers, if they have a pedal point in the bass, which is where it frequently occurs, they're ignoring the function of inversions and just going for smooth voice leading. Now, if the pedal point is in another part, it's worth putting in the inversion symbols. So here's the example. The pedal point is underneath. And here's the left hand playing. This is very common in the Baroque era, particularly in organ music, because the organist can just put their foot down on the pedal and move their hands and fingers up above, making lots and lots of notes. This is, of course, where it gets its name, the pedal point.